To begin with, this isn't an all-encompassing history of the groups I want to be talking about in this video. I'm just going to go over as much history as I feel like I need to get you guys to understand why they may have morphed into these versions that we see now. If you want to read more or watch some videos, I'll link the sources that I used down in the description. But for now, I'll get on with the video. I'm just going to start with Cowboys, because, I don't know, they're my favorite. To start off with, let's do a little exercise. Picture a cowboy in your mind. Okay, you're done. I'm going to guess they look something like this, or maybe even this. And now let's take a picture of a real historical cowboy. Listen, cowboys are a little bit whitewashed. The original cowboys came from Mexico, and they were called vaqueros. If you want to be more specific, they came from Spain, which Spain got it from the Moors, which are Arab-descended group of people that basically influenced Spanish culture for like 800 years. And when Spain went to South America and, did a little bit of colonization, they were like, hey, we have all these cows, but I'm not doing no fucking work with cows. Let's get our Moors slaves to do it. And so they did. They did cattle work, and they taught the other slaves how to do cattle work, and they're really fucking good at it, honestly. And by the 17th century, I'm going to be very loosey-goosey with dates. I mean, there's like a couple, like, I need to establish this came before this, but that's not real. It's not important. But by the 17th century, descendants of the Spanish and Native Americans were working with cattle using Spanish methods. And these were the first Mexican vaqueros. Men who had fucking been riding horses since they were strapped to their mom's back in cradles. They were born for it, and they were good at it. Enter Richard King and Mifflin Kennedy. They were two men/business partners that they looked at the Texas Longhorn, and they were like, we can do something with that. They acquired a ton of land in South Texas, and then only after that, apparently, they were like, we don't have any experience ranching. We don't know what to do. Kennedy went on to hire a bunch of vaqueros from the Rio Grande area, while King traveled to Cruillas in northern Mexico, offering the entire impoverished town housing and jobs for life if they would move back to his ranch. And about 100 families accepted, and these people taught King and Kennedy everything they knew, from stuff about cattle to training horses, up and down the whole list. King would eventually drive his tens and thousands of cattle up north, establishing the American ranching industry and building one of the most successful beef-producing operations in the U.S. Now, I wouldn't blame you for not knowing this. It's not exactly at the forefront of cowboy lore, but it's not a coincidence. It's not something that has naturally been just more obscure knowledge. The Mexican Revolution led to a spell of anti-Mexican sentiment in America, basically giving white people a reason to erase them from the history books. But that's how they got a lot more white. But how did they go from normal dudes working with cattle to heroes and icons of the West, gunslinging, saving the day, stuff like that? I wish I could say it was a complicated answer and that I could sit here and make you listen to my voice for hours on end, delving into the intricate topics, but it's really not. This mischaracterization stems from dime novels, mostly. Dime novels were comic book-esque novels about Western culture. They were widely read and had a massive, almost singular impact on what would evolve into what we now know as the American Western as a genre. They were not complex. The white man comes to untamed area or near, an untamed area, and he saves his family, he saves the town, saves a woman from, to be honest, mostly minorities. It's pretty distinctly, the Mexican bandit or the filthy Jew. I don't know. It's terrible. Dime novel writers also found that books sold better if they used real notable Western figures. So people like Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, and even someone like Jesse James made frequent appearances. And here's where the shift begins. Before this time, Hunters and trackers were most often the heroes of dime novels, wild men who lived off the land and represented white America's promise to conquer and tame the vast wilderness. When outlaws became more interesting figures due to cultural shifts, the foundation that existed remained, wild men of the West, and were mixed into with outlaw characters and imagery. This outlaw imagery was all mixed up in a region where these stories were set, which was most often mining and cattle towns. In each instance, men on horseback with revolvers and a Western-style clothing were thought to be the norm, even though that's not really the case. But writers out east had never actually seen the things they were writing about with that imagery. That type of imagery was further stained into the imagination of readers by the rise of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. It was a sort of touring circus of sorts that further played up the imagery of Western tropes that are now so ingrained in people's imaginations. So, in review, the reasons why cowboys are so different than their origins is, number one, racism. Go figure, honestly. Number two, just shitty books, shitty manufactured books. I mean, not a lot of these stories are, like, fantastic. There's a reason why people probably don't know what dime novels are. I mean, it's a wonder, really. Also, side note, did you know that cowboy is originally a pejorative term for African-American cowhands? Yeah, go figure. Something is rooted in racism once again. But way back when, post-Civil War, there was a huge influx of African-Americans that were looking to, for work. And it came out of this weird thing where regardless of age, white people will just call African-American people boy. Like, no matter if they're older, younger, whatever. I don't know. Not so fun side note. So, in review, I know this wasn't a lot, but I was trying to hit the bullet points. The reasonings can be chalked up to, number one, racism. Go figure, I guess. Number two, dime novels. Jesus Christ, a lot of dime novels. And number three, honestly, that political shift in the 1870s that moved them from the kind of being adjacent working men to outlaws with hearts of gold and these sort of vigilante-esque characters. That's pretty much it. I mean, that's it. Alright, so let's do that visualization thing again. Imagine a samurai. They probably look something like this. Well, they actually look like... Alright, so listen. The differences in samurai aren't exactly visual. I guess the thing about samurai that kind of distinguishes them from these other two little factions is that there's a point in time that you can point at and be like, yeah, that's the badass samurai that I know and I've seen in movies. But for this video, I kind of want to touch on the before and after of the badass samurai period, because that's where we get more of a holistic view of the samurai. Now, I know what you're saying. Condensing thousands and thousands of years of rich history into a tiny little video is insane. Which is why I'm not going to do it. I don't want to. To make a very, 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 very long story short, samurai started out as a class of bureaucrats, then forming into a sort of long-term mercenary, selling their sword to whoever could pay them and give them enough stability. Then, during the Warring States periods, you had genuine armies of samurai coming together and fighting for power. And then after that, they kind of went back to bureaucrats. So, when you think of samurai, I don't think I would be remiss in assuming that you think of an honorable warrior. You think of the Bushido Code, which, is widely talked about in terms of samurai. So, when you think of samurai, I don't think I would be remiss in assuming that you think of an honorable warrior. You think of the Bushido Code, which, is widely talked about in terms of samurai. Well, the thing is, like any code, it was written and rewritten to suit the needs of, well, whoever wrote it. And I mean, with any sort of set of rules you apply to a group of people, it's usually never required to follow. I mean, realistically and often, you could be the scummiest man alive, but as long as you held loyalty to whoever was paying you, you would still be a good samurai in a sense. You would still have that loyalty that Bushido held so dearly. So, I mean, yeah, samurai aren't perfect. I mean, who is? But it's just another reason to see these groups as three-dimensional and not these sort of caricatures that we see in some media today. So, with knights, the term comes from the French word chevalier, or I think it's just knight, which derives from a different word, and it just means knights or mounted heavy cavalry. And it was first used by the Franks in the previous 2 centuries, so like 8th century AD. And basically 2 centuries after that, they made chivalry, which was an attempt to regulate the violence that the Frankish society was experiencing because they had all these bored, privileged soldiers. Now, there's an argument to be had about how chivalry affected women at the time. They were held as objects of reverence and therefore kind of had power over the men that desired to be around them, but they were at the same time regulated to the position of appendages to the men. As chivalry became more stylized, women were increasingly restricted in what they could do on what made a woman worth pining over or being chivalrous for, that sort of thing. But either way, it's unclear whether it worked at all. I mean, I couldn't find any sources saying it did or didn't. Most of the sources did say, we don't fucking know, which, I don't know, it's a hard thing to measure anyways. But something interesting is that post-medieval era, I think that's not the proper term anymore, but we're going to ride with it for now. During the Renaissance, we looked back upon the Romans and Greeks and saw that as the epitome of enlightenment. And we looked down upon the medieval ages as straying from those Roman and Greek roots. So things like knights weren't exactly cool, and I believe that's how we get works such as Don Quixote that are pretty critical and satirical of the code of chivalry, way back when. But no one did more to rehabilitate the image of the medieval ages more than Sir Walter Scott. He was an avid collector of folk tales and a student of medieval history. He wrote several best-selling novels that reshaped popular images of the medieval ages, in Ivanhoe in 1819 and Quentin Durward in 1823. He invoked a world of chivalric romance with daring knights and maidens in distress. The conceptions we have today of the Middle Ages, such as the knight in shining armor, mostly come from his novels. And there's something I should mention that I forgot to mention in the samurai section, to a lesser extent the cowboy section. There's also this idea that these 3 factions roamed around doing good, but it just wasn't the case. For cowboys, obviously, they really had a job. For samurai, they also mostly sat near their lords being bodyguards, or, in some cases, they went out and collected taxes. It's not like they searched out for wrongs to right. The same with knights. They had their land whenever they were sent off to war, they did, but it's not like they rode around looking for a maiden in distress. And that's it. I wish I could wax philosophically more about these people, but I don't think I'm very smart enough to do that. So I'm just going to leave it off there.